It was here, in this room, that Luther translated the entire New Testament into German. In just 11 weeks, he accomplished one of his greatest life goals, to give his people the scriptures in their language. Luther's disappearance caused quite a stir. Rumors wildly circulated. Some thought he was dead. His enemies rejoiced. But as his new publishings came off the press, it became clear that he was not dead, but alive. However, with Luther physically hidden away, a dark and sinister shadow began to fall across the Reformation movement.
A peasant revolt swept through the countryside, and the enemies of the Reformation were quick to blame it on the teachings of Martin Luther.
The Reformation was on the verge of falling apart. Torn from within and opposed from without, Luther could no longer stay hidden. He left the castle without protection and entered the pulpit, preaching, rebuking, and encouraging his followers. The Reformation was saved. But opposition from the state church was far from over. The next movements would determine the future of Europe and the world.
In 1526, the Imperial Diet met for the first time in Speyer, Germany. The leaders from across the country met here in the Speyer Cathedral to discuss important decisions, one of which was the spread of the Reformation.
Emperor Charles V knew that he would have to walk a very delicate line. He, along with the state church, was desirous to snuff out the Reformed heresy. But he also knew that some of the princes were pushing for freedom to practice religion as their conscience dictated. The fledgling Reformation hung in the balance.
To protect the Reformation, God raised up an unlikely ally from the east. The Ottoman Turks were advancing towards Europe. Every kingdom had fallen before them. 75 years before the Imperial Diet, Constantinople had fallen to the Turks. This was significant in the European mind, as Constantinople was considered the queen of cities because of its advanced fortifications. For over 1,000 years, these walls had stood unbreached. A massive chain would be hauled across the harbor to prevent any ships from being able to attack from the sea. No matter how the city was approached, it was considered to be impregnable. That is, until the Ottoman Turks attacked.
One of the original cannons used to destroy Constantinople still exists today, and I've traveled to Fort Nelson in England to see it.
The Turks advanced on Constantinople. They came with the largest cannon that had ever existed up to that point. 17 feet long, it could shoot projectiles that weighed up to 670 pounds over a mile in distance. As they arrived, I can imagine the terror that the inhabitants must have felt as they looked over the wall and saw the massive army of the Turks who gathered around with these huge cannons beginning to shake and destroy their wall.
Even now, as the Diet was taking place, the Ottoman Turks were sweeping north and nearing the borders of Charles V's empire. At the Battle of Mohawks, the Hungarian army had been destroyed. There was no longer a buffer between the fierce Ottoman Empire and the rest of Europe. The emperor had made up his mind. Luther had already been outlawed. The Reformation must be stopped. But as long as the Turks were advancing, Charles V needed the cooperation and military support of the Protestant princes, and he was forced to tolerate their reforms to save his kingdom.
In 1529, another serious threat was to be encountered.
The Diet met again, and a law was proposed that would allow the reformed areas to remain reformed. However, the spread of biblical doctrines to other areas would be prohibited.
Well, on the surface, this appeared to be a concession. The Reformed leaders realized that if truth could not spread, it would die. Many Germans, even under Catholic princes, had accepted the Reformed doctrine. If these restrictions were implemented, civil war was imminent.
The Reformed German princes put their life and lands on the line as they respectfully but forcefully lodged a formal protest against the edict. They said, "Let us reject this decree. In matters of conscience, the majority has no power." The proposed laws failed.
Charles saw that his plans had been thwarted again. He needed these princes and their men to fight against the Turks. The term Protestant was coined in honor of these princes who protested against the unfair laws.
Through an unexpected source, the Reformation had been protected once again. If the Ottoman Turks had not been pressing from the east, the Reformation could have been crushed. While the advancement of the Turks was checked during the siege of Vienna in 1529, their continued presence distracted the armies and allowed the flickering flame of the Reformation to become a steady blaze. In England, another giant of faith was rising in the early 1500s. This man would significantly shape the English language and religion perhaps more than any other. His name was William Tyndale.
In 1494, Tyndale was born here in Gloucestershire, England, an area dominated by the wool industry. He grew up among farmers and textile workers. It was this humble beginning that laid the foundation for his future success.
He attended Oxford University, where he received one of the finest educations available in his day.
Tyndale moved back to Gloucestershire, England, and became a tutor for the Welsh family. His hosts would often have the leading men of the city over, and Tyndale loved to sit down with them and discuss the new ideas which were sweeping through Europe. One evening, he was discussing with a group of monks when one of them said that he would rather have the laws of the Pope than the Bible. Tyndale was appalled and heatedly responded, "I defy the Pope and all his laws. If God spares my life ere these many years, I will translate a Bible into English so that the plowboy may know more scripture than you."
Little did they realize how Tyndale, the lowly son of a farmer, was destined to shape the English language, perhaps more than any other.
After the fall of Constantinople, documents began to flow west as people fled from the advancing Turks. As these manuscripts arrived in Western Europe, there was a renewed interest in Greek and Hebrew. Scholars wanted to study the Bible in its original language. One of them, Erasmus, compiled the many Greek New Testament versions into one compilation. He published this as a single New Testament with Greek and Latin side by side. This was invaluable to Tyndale as he translated the Bible into English.
As Tyndale continued his study and translation of the Bible, tension with local religious authorities rose, and in order to avoid the charge of heresy, Tyndale fled to London, where he hoped to get permission to publish a Bible in English.
In London, he asked Tunstall, who was Bishop of Durham, for permission to publish his Bible. But Tunstall was a strong believer that the Bible should not be in the language of the people. He let Tyndale know, in no uncertain terms, that his Bible was not welcome in London, and made sure to shut every other door for publishing as well.
With legal permission denied, Tyndale decided to go underground. Within a short time, he had boarded a ferry and left England, never to return. He must have known this would make him a hunted man for the rest of his life. Once in Europe, Tyndale was constantly moving, translating long hours each day and in continual danger of capture. In 1525, he completed the New Testament and started printing 3,000 copies in Cologne. Unfortunately, the printer shop was raided, and Tyndale barely escaped with his life. Managing to save some of the pages of the translated work, he traveled to the city of Worms to finish. finally, he was able to print it. His Bible, though it was expensive, was an instant bestseller. Because of the invention of the printing press, it no longer took 11 months to copy the Bible by hand. Now, a Bible could be produced in a matter of days.
Soon, much to the distress of the authorities, Tyndale's New Testaments started showing up in England. Merchants were smuggling them in containers filled with food and wool. Even though they were expensive, people bought them as soon as they became available. They were small and easily fit inside your pocket. This was important, as owning one always came at the risk of losing your life. The state church, in a desperate attempt to keep Tyndale's Bible away from the people, bought up hundreds of copies and brought them here to St. Paul's Cathedral in London to be burned. But the proceeds from these sales were sent back to Tyndale, who used them to print even more Bibles.
In 1535, Tyndale was betrayed by a man he trusted. He was captured near his residence by officers of Charles V.
In Vilvoorde, Tyndale was imprisoned under deplorable conditions. We still have a letter that he wrote to the prison warden asking for warmer clothes, oil for his lamp, and his books so that he could continue translating the Old Testament. Finally, after 15 months of imprisonment, he was led from his cell to be burned. He was led to the stake, the wood was piled around him, and the fire was lit. His final words were, "Lord, open the King of England's eyes." When he'd finished burning, they scooped up his ashes and threw them into the river behind me. And why did they burn him? For translating the Bible into English.
Within 4 years, Tyndale's dying prayer was answered. In England, Miles Coverdale was able to publish the Coverdale Bible, based almost entirely on Tyndale's work. In 1539, King Henry VIII authorized the publishing of the Great Bible, the first authorized Bible in English history. In 1611, King James Version, the most famous Bible of all times, was published. Over 84% of the King James New Testament is Tyndale's work. 75% of the Old Testament books that Tyndale was able to translate found its way directly into the King James Version.
In it was life, and the life was the light of men. And the light shineth in darkness, and the darkness comprehended it not. The Reformers, such as Martin Luther and William Tyndale, shared one great desire: that the Bible be made available not just to the priests and the monarchs, but also to the common plowboy. The shadows of the Dark Ages were lifting as people were able to read the Bible for themselves.